Fantastic, thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's so wonderful to be back at Romancing the Gothic after a little while away. So today I'm going to be speaking about Gothic tonalities and tourism in experiencing Emily Bronte's poetry through its recent adaptation into a song cycle by folk band the Unthanks. But before we kick off, I just wanted to introduce myself for those who haven't met me before. So my name is Ruth-Anne, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently working as a research associate at St Mary's University in Twickenham on theology and sustainability in education. So I've made a quick detour into the social sciences for a year, but I am going to be starting my PhD at the University of Warwick in November, focusing, as Sam said previously, on literature and theology in 19th century eco-Gothic hellscapes. So this project is a little bit different from my kind of primary area. It's one that I started to develop during my MA at Lancaster as a special subject module, supervised by the wonderful Catherine Spooner. So it's very much for me a work in progress. It's something I'd love to develop in future, but I'm not quite sure what shape that's going to take yet. Maybe that's something we can discuss a little bit later. So I really do welcome your feedback and suggestions, whether you're joining us live in the talk today or later on YouTube. So as an overview of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to start by giving some context to the musical adaptations of Emily's poetry that this talk is going to focus on, with some background to the Bronte Parsonage Museum as a site for Gothic tourism. And then I'll give a couple of in-depth examples of the music adaptations themselves to explore how they bring out the Gothic themes in Bronte's poetry. And as this talk is going to be focusing a lot on the specific places where listeners encountered Bronte's poetry through the Unthanks' songs and the Bronte Parsonage Museum as a literary heritage site, I've tried my best to convey this through various means. We've got a short video and kind of an account of what the walk is like, what the exhibit was like, and also all of the photographs throughout the kind of slides are photos I've taken in Haworth over the years to try and give you a sense of the landscape, but also the museum and kind of the space that this exhibit occupied. So let's get into Emily Bronte's poetry and its musical reimagining by the Unthanks. Emily Bronte's poetry is synonymous with her musical accomplishments. As I hope you'll see throughout this presentation, Bronte frequently draws on musical terminology and rhythmic devices to make her poetry so enchanting and complex. Critics have echoed this language in analysing Bronte's work, such as Lawrence Starzyk, who describes her nature poetry as creating a contrapuntal symphony, and Janet Gazzari, who notes Bronte's fine musical ear when reading her verse. John Hennessy's book on the topic makes this connection between poetry and music so most explicit, describing Emily as the most musically accomplished of all the Bronte children, with her knowledge and love of music having a profound influence upon her writing. And John Hennessy's book is really fantastic for giving some context of the influences on all of the Bronte children's musical influences. It catalogues all of the musical manuscripts that we know the Brontes owned. So we might think of Emily as poet and musician, the two creative forms communicating with one another. And the Shall Earth No More Inspire Thee exhibit in 2019 at the Bronte Parsonage Museum expanded this connection between Bronte's music and poetry in new Gothic tones. Folk group the Unthanks set 10 poems by Emily to music to create this song cycle. Initially designed as an immersive experience where visitors heard the music while walking on Haworth Moor, it's now available on streaming services worldwide as the album Lines Part 3, Emily Bronte. But before diving into the musical adaptations themselves, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the context of this exhibition. So throughout this paper, I'm applying the Gothic as a critical lens because neither Emily nor the Unthanks indicated an intentional use of the Gothic. In particular, I want to look at how this exhibit engages with Gothic tourism as defined by Emma McAvoy. McAvoy defines Gothic tourism as the act of visiting for the purposes of leisure, a location that is presented in terms of the Gothic, its associated tropes, discourses, and conventions. McAvoy explores how things like ghost walks or castles or dungeons present themselves as haunted using Gothic narratives to attract visitors. And the Bronte Parsonage Museum might be one such site where the Gothic tourist encounters the Bronte sisters' past home. And while the museum displays, as you would expect, many items behind glass cases, it quite uniquely lays out numerous artifacts on the tables in each room of roped off areas, giving the impression that the sisters had maybe just recently left the room, so they've just wandered down Haworth High Street and could come back at any moment. However, some critics have suggested that this kind of framing of Gothic tourism holds potential dangers or limitations. McAvoy warns that because it's preset narrative arc, its demonizing of the past, its potentially one-sided take on history, recourse to the Gothic is a potentially dangerous strategy. This risk of offering a limited historical view is something that Nicola Watson has also highly criticised of the parsonage, stating, Haworth Parsonage insists that writing is always autobiographical and that it transforms nothing. It makes the labour of writing all but invisible. And she continues that the parsonage presents only a pathetic litter of clothes, boots, and other relics. Some quite harsh criticism, perhaps, but this insistence on writing as autobiography is a potential pitfall for the museum and the exhibit that we're focusing on today. For example, the poem Deep, Deep Down in the Silent Grave is prefaced by the fact that Emily had lost her mother and two sisters by the time that she wrote it, and it's played as you enter the churchyard for the first time. So the way that the exhibit ties each poem or song to a particular geographic location could present this one-sided take on history, that the Brontes' work is always autobiographical, that in the case of Deep, Deep Down in the Silent Grave, it came out of grief and kind of familial loss. I, however, have a slightly, maybe a rebuttal or a slightly less harsh view maybe than Watson, because I think the parsonage offers a much more complex and nuanced view on the Brontes than Watson's criticism allows. So this concern for the parsonage presuming writing as autobiography assumes the presence of an autobiography or a biography in the case of Emily. If there is only a pathetic litter of items, it's because there are so few surviving Bronte manuscripts. And some people might remember the kind of media attention around some new Bronte manuscripts that come out of a private collection because they are so rare. Furthermore, if their writing is all but invisible in the house's confined space, it's because the Brontes so deeply embedded their writing practice within the domestic sphere. Emily and Anne's diary paper of 1837 exemplifies this connection. For example, it describes within the same breath the household servant Tabby in the kitchen, along with the emperors and empresses of Gondal preparing for their coronation, recounting the young sisters' juvenilia. But in short, this kind of diary paper might show that the parsonage creates a connection between the known biographical information of the Brontes and their writing because the surviving evidence suggests such a relationship. And I think that the museum doesn't shy away from showing their literary achievements alongside domestic works' predominance in their daily lives. But let's return to the exhibit itself rather than this kind of conceptualization of Haworth Parsonage. So this construction of the parsonage as a site of Gothic tourism is something capitalized on in the marketing of the Shall Earth No More inspire the exhibit. Its leaflet, which you can see on screen, describes the project as an audio experience, which takes participants on a circular walk from the Bronte Parsonage Museum up to nearby Penistone Hill. And I'm always so interested what it means by audio experience, because it implies that the music is not just meant to be listened to, but felt, or that it creates an encounter in some way. The leaflet expands that this route follows paths the Brontes would have walked and takes in a view of Top Withens, which many people believe was the inspiration for Wuthering Heights in Emily's novel. More than just experiencing Emily's poetry then, the exhibit implies that visitors will somehow walk in the deceased sister's footsteps in a ghostly recreation of their daily life. And as much as we would perhaps like to do a Romance in the Gothic field trip to do the walk for ourselves, I thought instead of that, at least I could show you the parsonage's promotional videos so that you can get a sense of the different songs for those who haven't listened to the album before, but also how the exhibit was marketed and how it was kind of conceptualized and brought together. So I'll just play this for you now.
The night is darkening round me, the wild winds coldly blow, but a tyrant spell has bound me.
This project is a new and exciting thing for us, but in a way we treat it like we treat anything, which is to try and tell the story of the words that are there, and I think that's how we've approached this as well.
Well, I think we always look to be moved by words and emotionally, and with Emily Bronte's poetry, they're very passionate and dark, and that's something that we always look for in material.
It's been a total pleasure. I've developed quite an affinity with the instrument. It's very pretty sounding. I feel like it's what I've been looking for years.
Lucky, really.
Yeah, it's a huge privilege really to have this time to explore her writing and kind of be entrusted with doing something with it. I mean, for us it's a really lovely journey to go on.
So there you go, there's an introduction to the exhibit and how it was marketed and how it was kind of brought together as well by the Unthanks. So there are 10 tracks in the exhibit, and it begins with a soundscape of Haworth Parsonage, which features the grandfather clock, which you can see in the parsonage, the nearby crows nesting in the trees at the church, and there are also footsteps which make it sound like someone's leaving the parsonage. You get a door closing as well, and presumably, or I like to think of it as though Emily's going on kind of an evening dog walk up Penistone. And then there are 9 poems that follow that are mapped onto the walk. And you'll notice that I put a comparison here between the exhibition and the publicly available album, because the Unthanks changed the order of the songs. And when I asked them about this, they said it was because the order didn't quite make sense without the landscape. So there's something here about this triangulation between landscape, music, and poetry, which turns the album into an audio experience. Another difference between the album and the exhibit is the use of an audio commentary. So as previously mentioned, when talking about Deep, Deep Down in the Silent Grave, the audio commentary does make biographical links between Emily's writing and her life. However, it also insists that, quote, connections between location and poetic content are all loose. So it allows this audio experience to dwell in an ambivalence between artistic imagining and historical recreation. And perhaps we can see this as a further rebuttal to maybe the dangers of Gothic tourism. This effect is amplified by the interchanging commentary between composer Adrian McNally and singer Rachel Unthank, creating multiple interpretive lenses for the listener and openly acknowledging that we can only speculate what Emily's poems are really about, what they really mean. For instance, McNally notes that Emily is so relentlessly dark that I feel she bore no self-consciousness or concern for her reader whatsoever. So we can see here McNally is perhaps foregrounding that Gothic potential in Emily's materials, that they're so relentlessly dark, but also that commentator's interjection, that first person I feel, indicates a necessity for an interpreter when approaching Emily's poetry. The result is a unique auditory space and experience between writer and reader, composer and landscape, with the listener acting as an interpretive interloper in between. And again, because we can't actually do the walk, because we maybe can't experience, I'm going to give a brief kind of overview of what the walk is like, based on my own account of when I went and did it. So here goes. On the 19th of December 2020, I visited the Bronte Parsonage Museum to participate in the Shall Earth No More Inspire the exhibition on a walk across Haworth Moor up Penistone Hill. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, the museum was closed, so I completed the walk using the audio recording provided by Adrian McNally, the music's composer and pianist. The walk begins on a short path from the parsonage towards St. Michael's and All Angels Church, accompanied by the album's soundscape. While I could already hear the wind and the crows from the surrounding space, the added sounds of footsteps and the parsonage clock were distinctly different. Having walked past the old schoolroom where the Brontes taught local children, the music begins with the track Deep, Deep Down in the Silent Grave, upon entering the churchyard to the right. The commentary recommends lingering here while the music commences, offering plenty of time to walk up towards the Bronte memorial plaque. From the top of the churchyard, you can see past the parsonage to across the moors. Now walking through the Kissing Gate and up Balcony Path, the second song, She Dried Her Tears, begins. The area is quite overcast with trees, and the path is also a popular local dog walk. To the right, there is Balcony Farm and the old house that accompanies it. And then emerging from this track and walking up the hill past Balcony Farm, I'm happiest when Most Away offers a light tone that reflects the change of landscape. From this height, there are stunning views across the valley. Emerging out onto the moors, Shall Earth No More Inspire Thee commences. Aside from a few telephone poles, there are few signs of human life on the moors. O Evening, Why Is Thy Light So Sad accompanies the short walk to the top of Penistone Hill. Following this sombre interlude, the commentary advises pausing at the trig point for High Waving Heather. The recorded soundscape of winds and blusting breezes merges with the real sound of the moorland wind. Starting to turn back around and descend from the hill, Lines offers a brisk tempo. Martin Heron's literary landscape sculpture is visible over the quarry. As we descend the moors, Remembrance, the track and poem, accompanies this walk back down balcony path. The final song, The Night is Darkening Round Me, which plays upon re-entering the churchyard and back towards the parsonage, concludes the exhibit. Upon finishing the walk, I felt profoundly moved by the music, despite having done this route many times before. This particular encounter was somehow different. And later that day, when scrolling on Twitter, I found out that Emily had died 172 years ago in 1848, on the very same day in the parsonage's front room. So there you go. There's a little bit of a Gothic twist to my own account. And before getting on to the songs themselves, I wanted to talk briefly about the story surrounding the music's composition, because it also engages with this use of Gothic narratives in tourism that McAvoy identifies. So we had the pleasure of interviewing the composer and pianist Adrian McNally for this research. And he recounted his walk to Topwithens during his stay in quite an extraordinary way. He said, "I've had a dream, a reoccurring dream since early childhood. I may never have remembered it. That was the thing for me until I saw Topwithens from a distance. I was like, oh my God, this is my dream. The dream I used to have, not just the house, the way it looked and the journey to it was all just so spot on with this memory. So to have had this vision all my life and then be commissioned to do this music and find myself in this place, it felt like somewhere I was always trying to find." Perhaps unknowingly, McNally's extraordinary account of visiting Topwithens and his reoccurring dream links to a more extensive tradition of authors inspired to write Gothic texts following a dream. Cue Mary Shelley, Robert Louis Stevenson, Horace Walpole, among many others. McNally's Gothic composition narrative becomes much more than a superficial marketing strategy then. It's deeply embedded in Gothic narratives and experiences for writer, composer, and listener alike. So I think that's just about enough context and background on the exhibit. Let's get on to some of the actual poems and songs themselves and how they bring out the Gothic aspects of Emily's poetry. And as this exhibit is so grounded in the moorland landscape of Haworth, High Waving Heather seems like a good place to start. So I'll read the poem's opening stanza. High waving heather neath stormy blasts bending, midnight and moonlight and bright shining stars, darkness and glory rejoicingly blending, earth rising to heaven and heaven descending, man's spirit away from its drear dungeon sending, bursting the fetters and breaking the bars. I really love here how the speaker moves so energetically between binary oppositions in the natural world, from bright shining to darkness, from earth rising to heaven descending. There's such scope here for an eco-Gothic reading of the landscape, where the boundary between nature and humanity is stretched to its frightening limits. But for now, let's focus on the sonic imagery and rhythmic devices in play here. Isabella van Elfren, whose book on Gothic music is a wonderful starting point for any analysis in this topic, argues that music can move listeners into the liminal spaces of Gothic, between past and present, between God and the devil, until music engenders a space and time of its own. And I think we can see that effect here. The poem is utilizing dynamic verbs of bending and blending, descending and sending, to conclude each line in an enjambment, creating this perpetual, endless motion and constant cycle of change. The stanza culminates in nature bursting the fetters and breaking the bars, a transgressive movement that travels into a new space beyond the restrictive dungeon bars. But crucially, it never specifies what that space is or what it might be. Bronte emphasizes this change through a really subtle kind of sonic shift in alliteration, from the dental D of drear dungeon to the plosive B's of bursting and breaking. It's a much fuller sounding syllable, those plosive B's, which expands the limits of the stanza's sonic expression. The Unthanks' interpretation emphasizes that poem's unsettling stretching of time and space through various musical techniques. So let's have a listen to the first verse/stanza of High Waving Heather.
High waving heather, neath stormy blast bending, midnight and moonlight and bright shining stars, darkness and glory rejoicingly blending, rising to heaven and heaven descending, and spirits away from its drear dungeon sending, bursting the fetters and breaking the bars.
So there we go, that's our first taste of the Unthanks' interpretation. So there are various musical techniques at play here, and perhaps the most obvious one is something known as word painting on this line that I put on screen, earth rising to heaven and heaven descending, because the melodic line highlights the opposing states, with rising matching the melody's ascending minor third, while descending falls by a minor second. The imagery for me here brings to mind that state between God and the devil that Elfrin alluded to. But the melodic line, it somehow subverts our expectations. So what we almost want to hear, what we would normally hear, is a continued falling pattern across that three-syllabled descending. Instead, what we get is the held F sharp, settling on the same note rather than continuing to descend and resolve on D or E, which would be a much more melodically pleasing note maybe, or harmonically pleasing, I should say. But it doesn't, it settles on this F sharp, and it's kind of unsettling. We want it to resolve, but it doesn't. The Unthanks also turn the poem into a dialogue between the two singers, which is an interesting choice because it blurs the distinction between each poetic line. They hold each final note of each phrase into the subsequent one, which you can see here. And the result is this continuous melodic line split between alternating singers, vocalizing perhaps that enjambment that we saw in Emily's poem, but also nature's endless blending that we kind of were talking about previously. It's kind of bringing that aspect to life. And then an interesting note on kind of the time of the track. The track feels like it's in 5/4 time signature. I was also asked recently why I didn't transpose it into 6/8 time signature. That also didn't fit. It was really difficult to get this track to fit into a set time signature because the singers hold some notes longer than others, giving the feeling of free time despite the regularity of the falling quaver rhythm and the piano accompaniment. So it should fit in a set time signature, but somehow it doesn't. So somehow this track is, at least from as far as I can see, defying the rules of most Western music conventions to exist in a time of its own devising. So through these numerous techniques, we can start to see how this musical interpretation is prying open the liminal spaces in Bronte's poem in Gothic tones, transcending the limits of the page to turn High Waving Heather into an auditory experience. As with so many adaptations, the poems undergo various changes to take their musical form. And I think this process is perhaps most pertinent in The Night is Darkening Round Me. Of the Unthanks' selection, this poem is perhaps the most supernaturally themed of the album. And in the Penguin edition of Emily's Complete Poems, which is the one used by the Unthanks in the adaptation process, this poem comprises of numerous fragments posthumously knitted together by editors. So as a kind of overview of the narrative we seem to get, the first half is a speaker who is spellbound and frozen, saying, I cannot go. They're kind of frozen to the spot. While the second half seems to be a second speaker answering in a kind of dialogue, promising to try and free them, to come when thou art saddest, and offering them protection from the evening's chilly gloom. However, the final stanza of the poem is unfinished, and it reads as follows. I would have touched the heavenly key that spoke alike of bliss and thee. I would have woke the entrancing song, but its words died upon my tongue. And then I knew that hallowed strain could never speak of joy again, and then I felt. So we get various kind of, again, techniques and bits and pieces going on here. The repeated phrase of I would indicates the speaker's unfulfilled intentions of some auditory voicing of this heavenly key or entrancing song that they're promising. And while these might relate to the second speaker's attempt to free the first speaker from their spell with even more magic and entrancement, the imagery also continues Emily's association with music in the kind of choice of images that she's evoking here. And then that unfinished line, and then I felt, indicates a resolve from the speaker and a conclusion that the reader can never know. And in this sense, the poem's darkened nature and supernatural spells lacks the resolution we would usually find in most Gothic tales. You know, normally we get some kind of explanation, some resolution of what's happened and why it's happened to explain the events, but instead, for this poem, we get a perpetual ambiguity that we will never know what the poem might have resolved into. So again, let's listen to this section of the poem in the Unthanks' musical interpretation.
I would have touched the heavenly key that spoke alike of bliss and thee. I would have woke the entrancing song, but its words died upon my tongue, and then I knew that hallowed strain could never speak of joy again, and then I felt the night is darkening round me.
There we go. So the Unthanks' track here reflects that speaker's ambitious reach for the heavenly key. Again, we get a little bit of word painting here as the two sisters' harmony move from its usual close of major or minor thirds, and it kind of reaches up to a major six on that heavenly key to deliver this bright tone, that voicing of the speaker's hopeful intentions before coming back down to that close harmony that the Unthanks are so well known for. What's really interesting here, though, is that the Unthanks don't end the song on the poem's incomplete notes, but instead repeat the first stanza. And at the end of that verse, they also repeat the final line of that stanza, stating, I cannot go 3 times over to conclude the track, but also the audio experience, because it's the last song that plays. Here, the Unthanks are acting more than adapters. They step into the role of literary editors for their listeners, turning Emily's fragments into a readable or listenable, comprehensible format. And in bringing the poem full circle to that spell which bound the speaker to their spot, the circular walk and song cycle almost enact this process, leaving the listener spellbound in a literary landscape to experience Emily's work in new ways. Perhaps then the exhibit moves from a mere adaptation into some form of experiential Gothic format, where we're not just here to listen to Emily's poems, but to live them, to enact them, to go on this circular walk and listen to this song cycle in a repetitive process. With the album also allowing anyone to experience Emily's Gothic verse from their own homes or maybe their own local walks. And though I don't think this was an intentional aspect of the Unthanks' adaptation process, it certainly seems to be pushing the boundaries of Gothic tourism into an ethereal Gothic tonality that maybe is a new thing. Maybe we haven't seen this before. So as my last example then, and I hope that analysis so far has given some insight into how the musical adaptations are playing with those existing Gothic themes and techniques. But as that last example, I'd like to briefly talk about the exhibit's resulting effects using this Gothic music with the title of another poem/track, Remembrance. So in Bronte's poem Remembrance, we see a speaker mourning a lost love from their youth, with the opening lines stating, "Cold in the earth, the deep snow piled above thee, far, far removed, cold in the dreary grave. Have I forgot my only love to love thee, severed at last by time's all-severing wave?" There's an almost stereotypical Gothic narrative here of the dead haunting the living that they have left behind. While the poem uses iambic pentameter, Bronte also employs caesura and dashes and commas, and also unexpectedly stresses the first syllable of each line to create a slowed funerary pace that perhaps reflects the speaker's spatial distance from their far, far removed lost love. Time's all-severing wave then extends its reach from life to death to suspend the reader in an altered poetic time, resonating in a Gothic tone. Ghizzari cites several meanings of remembrance are relevant here. That operation of the mind involved in recalling or recollecting, the surviving memory of a person, a keepsake or token that serves to remind one person of another. However, I want to argue that the musical adaptation shifts the tone of remembrance from the speaker's lost love to the listener's remembrance of Emily. In the audio commentary, Rachel Unthanks notes that this is the only track not composed by McNally, stating, "When I read the words to this poem, it immediately reminded me of traditional keening songs, lamenting a lost loved one and expressing grief and sorrow. And so I took the tune used with the traditional song, I Am Stretched on Your Grave, which I heard through the singing of Irish trio Voice Squad, and adapted it to Emily's words." Rachel's composition process here is really interesting because it's describing how she's bringing Emily's poetry into the folk tradition. Her reference to keening songs, that lamenting wail of cry of grief over the body of a dead loved one, further resonates with this poem by Bronte, but also Wuthering Heights, when infamously Heathcliff digs up Catherine's coffin and embraces the dead corpse. In this circular walk, the track plays on the return to the churchyard of St. Michael's and All Angels Church, which contains the Bronte family crypt, as the audio commentary reminds us. So we can see how this poem's context is shifting from a nameless speaker's grief to a musical lament of the poet's death, occupying a space near her burial site for the song's duration. So for the last time today, let's have a listen to this extract. So I've got two on this slide. The first is from Remembrance, and then Voice Squad's version of I Am Stretched on Your Grave. So we'll listen to Remembrance first.
Cold in the earth and the deep snow piled above thee, far, far removed, cold in the dreary grave. Have I forgot my only love to love thee, severed at last by time's all-severing wave?
And then I Am Stretched on Your Grave.
I am stretched on your grave and will lie there forever. If your hands were in mine, I'd be sure we'd not sever.
So hopefully there you can start to see the similarities between the two tracks. Both melodies use a B minor key signature. They're both in a 4/4 time signature, and they both repeat the opening melody twice in the sequence, which hopefully you can see on screen here with my slightly random annotated version. And the melodic pattern from both tracks also follows very similar arrangement in the opening lines. So we get that conjunct major second and minor third intervals with the occasional descending perfect fourth, for those who are interested in the musical terminology. The narratives are also comparable, with the speaker in the traditional tune stating that they'll lie on their loved one's grave forever, with the desire for some kind of reunion, asking if your hands were in mine. The musical phrasing in Remembrance similarly emphasizes the dead and decaying body, with the longer crotchet beats held on words including coals, thee, and grave. And this effect recalls Elfrin's theory that Gothic music exploits sound's ambiguous relation with embodiment because it suggests presence even when this presence is invisible or intangible, and is thus closely related to the ghostly. So Elfrin is describing in this section of her book how when a sound source becomes ambiguous, like wind or the disembodied spectral voice, as in Kathy at the window in Wuthering Heights, they evoke that ghostly presence. Except here, Emily's voice as a writer and the Unthanks' voices as singers become ambiguous. They become kind of blended together, with only a recording to evoke their bodily presence in both cases. When interviewing McNally, he described how he composed the music at night on the piano after the museum had closed. And he stated, "It felt like I was playing the whole house, like awakening something from history." And he kind of continued in the interview to describe, because the house is so small that by the time he'd played one chord, it had already reverberated around the other 3 rooms downstairs and come back to him in an echo by the time he'd played the next. So there's kind of an eerie process going on there, but there's something about using Emily's piano as an artifact that's one of a kind and it's rarely used, that seeks to evoke something of the poet. Throughout the tracks, the piano accompanies the singers as a wordless symbol, perhaps, of Emily's presence throughout these recordings. And in McNally's account, the music somehow brought the literary location back to life. And as my kind of concluding and profound ending note, perhaps then music has the power to reanimate in new Gothic tonalities. So as we start coming to the end, I just had a couple of questions that I wanted to put out there that maybe we might want to discuss or you might want to think about going forwards. So first off, does thinking about the relationship between music and poetry and landscape change our understanding of Emily Bronte? Would you read her poetry differently now? Or, I don't know, maybe it's more tied to landscape than it was before. I don't know. I'm interested to hear what you think. And then also, is Gothic tourism a dangerous strategy, as McAvoy suggests? Do you agree with McAvoy and Watson, or do you have a different opinion about Gothic tourism? And what makes music Gothic? This is perhaps a central question for me, but is all music inherently Gothic somehow, or does it need an added something to make it Gothic? And on that note, is this exhibit maybe part of a wider Gothic turn in contemporary British folk music? I've added some examples here for anyone who's interested in exploring this topic further, and I'll just quickly run through them. So we have Crow's Bones, which was another project the Unthanks were involved in, which took folk murder ballads and orchestrated them with instruments fashioned from old music boxes and other creepy sounds. Flit, which was another project organised by Martin Green, and actually anything done by Martin Green I think fits this category. But Flit took stories of migration and adapted them through music and animation using this kind of brown paper and origami. The Dead Stations, which was a project by Charlotte Hathaway and Mike Fass, narrated a story set at an abandoned train station in remote Scotland, surrounded by this seemingly endless forest where almost fairy tale elements started to occur. Song spells is perhaps spell songs even was perhaps the most well known on this slide. It's an adaptation of Robert Macfarlane's books, The Lost Words and The Lost Spells. And it was marketed with an almost magical quality, promising to enchant us with the love of nature. And then just more broadly, both Lady Maisry and The Imagined Village reimagine traditional folk tunes in particularly Gothic tones, so they might be another area of exploration. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this journey into the Gothic tonalities and tourism of Emily Bronte's poetry and its recent reimagining. If you want to find me on Twitter, please do. I'm always happy to answer questions. And for anyone who's interested, here are the works cited for this talk for anyone who fancies any further reading. So thank you very much for having me.